Welcome to EPG Pathshala. I am Dr. Neeru Tandon, Associate Professor, VSSD College, Kanpur. This is module number 4, Samuel Taylor Coleridge. It is written by Dr. Anjita Singh. In this module, we are discussing the life of Coleridge, his works, his association with Wordsworth, and some important poems written by him. Now, he was born in London on 21st October 1772, educated at Christ Hospital and Jesus College, Cambridge. He was stimulated by the French Revolution, and then he enrolled himself in the Royal Dragoons, but he left it in 2 months. Then he met Robert Southey and planned the Pantisocracy. Let me explain what the Pantisocracy is. It is an utopian scheme which was devised in 1794 by Coleridge in association with Southey, and that means all rule equally. Then he married Sara Hutchinson. He met Wordsworth and collaborated with Wordsworth in the lyrical ballads. He developed an increasing addiction to opium. After his marriage, he fell in love with Sara Hutchinson, began to suffer from depression and illness. Then he turned away from poetry to philosophy. He got separated from his wife, broke away from Wordsworth and also from Hutchinson. Then he died in 1834. Now, Wordsworth and Coleridge, always we take their name together as elder romantics. Now, they were the founders of the English Romantic movement, as both of them contributed much towards the lyrical ballads. But when we call them elder romantics, we should once again revise what is romanticism. What are the various ingredients of romanticism? According to Coleridge, the basic 4 things like emotion, freedom, spontaneity and honesty. They are 4 very important tenets of romanticism, and they also tried to follow them. Now, we are talking about Wordsworth and Coleridge. Without understanding the one, we cannot understand the other. William Wordsworth and Coleridge together were known as older romantics, and they were also called the Lake Poets, as they lived in the Lake District of Cumberland. After their first meeting in 1797, they developed intimate friendship. Coleridge became Wordsworth's greatest admirer and disciple, sitting at his feet every evening to listen to his theories and philosophies of poetry. Wordsworth inspired Coleridge, and he inspired him and just inspired to have the same love for nature which he had. Coleridge also became a nature lover because of the inspiration he got from Wordsworth. Wordsworth contributed the 2 main points in Coleridge's masterpiece, The Rime of the Ancient Mariner. They are the killing of the albatross and the navigation of the ship by dead men. Coleridge reciprocated Wordsworth's concern by pulling him out of depression and instigating lines written above Tintern Abbey. Wordsworth also dedicated the prelude to Coleridge, calling it Poem to Coleridge. This title, Prelude, was given later on. Coleridge's Ode on Dejection marks a parting of ways, as Coleridge now no longer conformed to Wordsworth's theory of nature. Based on his study of Kant, Coleridge now believed that nature only furnishes the raw material of sensation on which the mind imposes its own forms of thought. So, this way he differed from the theory of Wordsworth. Coleridge, from poet turned philosopher, he had become seriously addicted to opium, which resulted in the loss of his creative faculties. This, together with his domestic troubles and turmoil, resulted in his Dejection ode. Wordsworth, on the other hand, was in a state of newfound bliss in love and wrote his Immortality ode. The two poets finally parted in 1810. The life and career of Coleridge can be divided into four distinct phases in terms of literary output. The first phase, that goes from 1794 to 1796, it was a brief period, but it was a period of experimental poetry. Poetic work coincided with enthusiasm for the French Revolution. He wrote some poems in collaboration with Robert Southey. He imbibed the spirit of 18th century poets like Collins and Gray. Then again, he was attracted towards Pantisocracy in this very period. I told you that Pantisocracy is an utopian society planned with Robert Southey and Lowell. It was to be established in New England. It was based on the ideal of equality as taught by William Godwin, but the project remained unimplemented. Now let's talk about his married and domestic life, because it was so important that it affected his literary life as well. Under social constraints, Coleridge got engaged to Southey's sister-in-law, Sara Hutchinson, whom he married in 1794. Initially, he appeared in love and dedicated a few love poems to her. The couple had 3 children, 2 sons and a daughter, but later he realized that he had no spark for his wife. They decided that this marriage is going to be failed, and it did. Domestic unhappiness affected his poetic impulse adversely, and Coleridge finally got separated from his wife in 1806. Friendship with the Wordsworth brought into Coleridge's life a deep passion in the form of Sara Hutchinson, sister-in-law to be of Wordsworth. Troubled by his marital incompatibility, Coleridge sought emotional refuge in his deep love for Sara Hutchinson. The lady treated him with care and affection, but the affair was largely one-sided. Coleridge dedicated his Dejection and ode to Sara, addressing her directly in the original draft. The address was finally changed to Lady. In place of name, he used the word lady, as the situation was hidden from public knowledge. After suffering a lot of guilt and remorse due to this extramarital attachment, Coleridge made a final break with Sara Hutchinson in 1810. Coleridge, in his second phase, which was from 1797 to 1798, transformed after meeting William Wordsworth in 1797. His meeting with William Wordsworth proved a milestone for him. His friendship with him led to the blossoming of Coleridge's poetic genius. Inspired by Wordsworth, Coleridge's poet from within, he came out. The two poets together ushered in the Romantic era in poetry with the lyrical ballads, and 1798 saw the emerging of lyrical ballads in flying colors. Coleridge wrote his most enchanting poems during this period, and he imbibed Wordsworth's love for nature. The poems of this period, most important poems are Frost at Midnight, Fears in Solitude, The Rime of the Ancient Mariner, Christabel, The Lime Tree Bore My Prison, The Nightingale, and the Kubla Khan. Third phase was a little longer, from 1798 to 1806. In 1798, Wordsworth and Coleridge travelled to Germany where Coleridge devoted himself to the study of the German philosophers. This period marks his departure from earlier held views on nature. Exiled himself and spent 2 years in wartime service at Malta. Then this period saw his formal separation from wife. He turned to delivering academic lectures, and his lectures on Shakespeare became very famous. The fourth and the final phase, from 1807 to 1834, the main period of his creative life, literary life, there it started with the final break with the Wordsworth and Sara Hutchinson. In this phase, he suffered a physical and mental breakdown for which he had to be treated. His career as a poet came to an end. Then he flourished as a lecturer, as a philosopher, and as a critic. Biographia Literaria is the product of this very period, and this became a landmark in his literary career. Let us concentrate on narrative techniques of Coleridge. Importance of imagination. It was realized by him and it was narrated through his technique. Coleridge had a definition of fancy that also he narrated, and his technique presented it. Coleridge imparted a magical quality to his poetry through superb flights of imagination and association of the supernatural element. Rhyme of the Ancient Mariner is the best example. The narrative method he employed is simple, matter of fact, but detailed and accurately descriptive, shifting effortlessly and unassumingly from the ordinary to the extraordinary. The manner used is of suggestion, but the craftsmanship is superb. Now, what is his theory of poetry? We know Wordsworth's theory of poetry, that he said that poetry is emotion recollected in tranquility. But when it comes to Coleridge, it is somehow different. He had high regard not only as a poet but as a critic also, but in the Biographia Literaria, very clearly he expounded his seminal theory of the imagination and fancy. The primary and secondary imagination synchronize as the organizing principle and the conscious human use of it respectively in the making of poetry, while the fancy is only a superficial aggregative power. The notion of organic unity is the focal point of his concept of the art of poetry. The immediate object of poetry is to afford pleasure by striking a balance between its component parts through proper metrical arrangement, thereby creating a perfect harmony. He was credited for introducing conversational poems. And now, just for an example, let us talk about an important poem of Coleridge, that is Kubla Khan. Kubla Khan is a fragmentary poem consisting of 54 lines. It has been divided into 2 stanzas and it was written in 1797. It was subtitled by Coleridge as A Vision in a Dream, a Fragment. It was inspired by the story of Kubla Khan, who was the Mongol ruler. As he was reading about Shanghai, the city founded by Kubla Khan, the poet fell asleep. He felt asleep induced by drugs, and in dream he composed 200 to 300 lines of a poem on which, on awaking, he could recall only a part. He was a more sensitive poet. That's why he could retain that much out of his dream. The poem begins with a description of the stately pleasure dome in Xanadu Kubla Khan's capital on the banks of the Alf River. The first stanza introduces the dichotomy of the sunny gardens and the sunless sea. The second part of the stanza enthralls with a magical description of a deep romantic chasm from which the river Alf has sprung. In Kubla Khan, Coleridge subtly introduces into the poem a depiction of nature in all its amazing forms and colors, shrouding it in deep mysticism. You know, mysticism is again an important part of romantic poetry. The stanza ends with the image of the pleasure dome floating on the water, a miracle of rare device, a summer palace situated next to caves of ice. The last line thrills with incongruous concepts. Then he discusses miracle versus device, sun versus sunlessness. The second stanza is a symbolic presentation of the creative process. The poet revives a dream. He had a maid yearning for her native land in her song, and he longs to recall the symphony which would inspire him to recreate in poetry the miraculous pleasure dome of Kubla Khan. The moment of poetic inspiration would throw him into a state of frenzy with flashing eyes and floating hair. The poet in frenzy is a fearsome sight to ordinary mortals because he is one who has actually drunk the ambrosia of celestial inspiration. In this poem, Coleridge is speaking of the power of human imagination, which transforms sense impressions into reality. Thus, in an unconscious fluid movement, the poem Kubla Khan unravels both an enchanted place in terms of magic and miracle, as well as the frenzied stage of the birth of poetry. The versification employs mainly iambic tetrameter and pentameter. Now there is another ode which is much talked about, Dejection and Ode, which also contains autobiographical element. The ode on dejection, it was published on 4th October 1802, which coincided with the 7th marriage anniversary of the poet himself and the wedding of Wordsworth to Sara Hutchinson. Originally titled Letter to Sara Hutchinson, this poem Dejection and Ode comes in form of an ode that is contradictorily used to express intimate emotions. Divided into 8 stanzas, it carefully leads the outpouring of grief to a climax and benediction. Coleridge craves for a storm to break out so that it may startle the dullness in him. He is suffering from a pain which has no outlet and which is inexpressible. The poet invokes a lady who may be the reason for his heartache and laments how all the beauteous sights and sounds of nature fail to evoke his failed genial spirits. This lady, which was termed in poem later on as lady, previously it was Sara. Coleridge expresses an aversion towards nature as an uplifting power and condemns it as an inanimate cold word. It is the soul of man which is the source of their joy, which creates beauty and is given only to the purer heart, which quality he upholds in his lady. The poet reflects on the changing course of joy in his own heart through the different phases of his life. The last stanza turns away from despair to an optimistic pronouncement of blessings upon the lady in the poem. The poem contains the essence of Coleridge's transcendental views on the organizing principle of the human mind, which is chiefly responsible for the creation of a new earth and a new heaven. The major theme, other than his own emotional state, is the beauty that man sees in nature. But his message is for man to be independent of nature and to sustain his own happiness. Here he is different from the philosophy of Wordsworth. The imagery used is vibrantly dramatic. The stanzas are in iambic, trimeter and pentameter. Now, critics have commented, I will just quote, Coleridge was a muddle-brained metaphysician who by some strange freak of fortune turned out a few real poems amongst the dreary flood of inanity. It was by Morris. To sum up, Coleridge, Samuel Taylor Coleridge, as a poet, as a writer, as a philosopher, as a dreamer, we can just concentrate on certain important facts that with Wordsworth, he initiated the Romantic age. He started the lyrical ballads, that is his contribution. He himself wrote various poems. His marriage and extramarital relationship troubled him. Even then, he got positive vibrations and again turned into a philosopher and wrote lectures on Shakespeare. He became a good lecturer. His definition of imagination and fancy thrilled the imaginative world, thrilled the literary world. So, Coleridge, no doubt, is a very important romantic poet of 19th century, and his association with Wordsworth had a long way to go, but unfortunately it came to an end, and separately Wordsworth and Coleridge, they created their own work of art. Thank you for visiting EPG Pathshala.